The German government didn't regard Hitler and his Nazi party as an idle threat. In fact, over a decade before Hitler managed to seize complete power, the German government was already taking steps against him and his beer hall political movement. There was also a feeling among some areas of the German population that something wasn't right with the National Socialist movement. An article in the New York Times, which ran in December of 1922, bore the title Berlin Hears Ford is Backing Hitler. The article details the concern brought to the attention of the American ambassador in Berlin by the renowned German newspaper, Berlin Tageblatt, that Ford was financing Hitler. The feeling was that Hitler's lavish accommodation in Munich, highly paid lieutenants, and the funds the Nazi Party was enjoying were more far reaching than could be provided solely by contributions from local German citizens. The article goes on to note that Hitler and his men were seen driving two brand new automobiles, that the wall next to Hitler's desk in Munich had a large portrait of Henry Ford, and owned many translated copies of Ford's books in his chambers. In 1931 interview, a 1931 interview given by Hitler to Detroit news reporter Annetta Antona generated another infamous quote about Henry Ford. During the interview, Antona asked Hitler why he had a portrait of Henry Ford next to his desk, to which Hitler replied, I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration. Henry Ford would become the source of great controversy yet again in 1938 when he accepted the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor that the Nazi Party could bestow upon a foreigner. The flashy medal consisted of an iron cross flanked by four Nazi swastikas. There was a backlash to this in the United States as the event was well publicized by newspapers such as the New York Times. Protesters could be found outside of Ford plants carrying signs with statements like, Why did Ford get a Nazi medal? The event also served to cause a few diplomatic issues between the United States and Germany at the time. The events were temporary, but the impact was definitely felt. Ford and forced labor. The Ford manufacturing activities in Germany would soon fall under the name Ford Werke in 1939. The French and German Ford manufacturing facilities would go on to produce not only vehicles and weaponry for the Nazi German military forces throughout the Second World War, but would use forced labor to do so. In fact, the forced labor aspect was in effect long before the start of the war, and even before Ford Werke was separated from the American Ford Motor Company. Forced labor was far from unique in Nazi-controlled Germany. There were there are reports that upwards of 7.5 million people were forced to relocate from their various conquered homelands to Germany and to work without compensation in order to keep the Nazi war machine running smoothly. A lawsuit was brought to court in New Jersey in 1998 by Elsa Iwanowa, one of the survivors that was ripped from her home and forced to work at Ford Verke. The Ford Motor Company went to court and acknowledged Iwanowa's claims and validated the forced labor, but denied any responsibility for the American wing of the company. The word at the time was that even after the Second World War began, the American wing of Ford Motor Company still owned a majority stock in Ford Verke. The lawsuit never got a chance to be fully realized since it was dismissed in 1999. The statute of limitations to raise a suit of that nature had unfortunately expired. The Ford legacy. When Henry Ford died on 7 April 1947, over 100,000 citizens made their way to his funeral and waited for several hours in a queue for a chance to view the body of the legendary Henry Ford. Today, Henry Ford is remembered as an influential industrialist and an American icon that changed the course of history. The people have turned Henry Ford into a heroic and immortal figure in history, often choosing to forget the very human and flawed man behind the brand name. The image of the Ford Motor Company began to change when the grandson of Henry Ford, Henry Ford II, took over control of the company in 1945. One of his first acts as president was to fire Ford's sketchy muscle and head of the Ford Service Department, Harry Bennett. He then set out to surround himself with experienced executives who assisted him in taking the company from the emotional brainchild of one man to a well-respected and long-lasting corporate entity. In 1956, the Ford Motor Company became a publicly traded corporation under the leadership of Henry Ford II. The Ford Motor Company is a very different company today than it was a century ago. In one glaring example of this, the president and chief executive officer of the company at the time of writing this book is a Jewish businessman named Mark Fields. The dark shadows of Henry Ford's legacy have been left far behind, and instead, the memory of his technological innovations remain. It would be hard to blame the modern day Ford Motor Company for wanting to brush the history of its founder under the rug in lieu of a legacy of hatred and bigotry.